Didn't check my phone until after 9 that morning. I'd been in the garden since 7, pulling up the last of the frost-killed tomato plants, the kind of mindless work I do when I can't sleep properly. My hands were dirty, my knees ached, and when I finally came inside and set the kettle on and picked up my phone from the counter, I had 4 missed calls from my daughter. Not texts, calls. She only calls when something is wrong. I rang her back before I even took off my gardening gloves. She picked up on the first ring, and what I heard in her voice was not crying exactly. It was something past crying, the hollowed-out sound a person makes when they've already used up all their tears, and what's left is just the bare fact of the situation. "Mum," she said, "I'm at Centennial Park, the one near the lake shore." I waited. I have the kids, and I have our bags, and I don't have anywhere to go. I looked at the kettle. I looked at my gloves. I pulled them off one finger at a time, set them on the counter, and said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." I did not ask what happened. I didn't need to yet. I'd been watching what was happening to my daughter for 2 years, the way you watch a slow leak in the ceiling, noting it, hoping it stops on its own, not wanting to make a fuss, and then one morning the whole thing gives way. Her name is Joanna. She's 34 years old. She has 2 children, a boy of 7 named Marcus and a girl of 4 named Lily. She married her husband 6 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I stood beside her in the September sun and thought he seemed like a decent man, quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixes things around the house and doesn't make promises he can't keep. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't understand fully until much later, was how completely a person can be remade by the family they marry into. Centennial Park is about 25 minutes from my house in Mississauga, depending on traffic. I made it in 18. I parked along the lakeshore and walked across the grass toward the water, scanning the benches. I found her near the splash pad, which was shut down for October, the concrete already grey with the coming cold, sitting on a bench with Marcus pressed against her side and Lily asleep across her lap. Around her feet were 4 large bags, a rolling suitcase, 2 duffel bags, a backpack with a unicorn on it that I recognized as Lily's. She looked up when she heard me coming, and something in her face, the brace she'd been holding, finally let go. I sat down beside her. I put my arm around her. I said nothing for a moment because there was nothing yet to say that was more useful than just being there. Marcus looked up at me with his father's eyes, calm, watchful, and said, "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Are you hungry?" He nodded. "Good," I said. "We'll fix that." I looked at Joanna. "Tell me when you're ready." She told me in the car. Once Marcus had a granola bar from my purse, and Lily was still asleep in her car seat. She told me in the flat, careful way people speak when they are describing something they still can't quite believe happened to them. She and her husband had been living in a house in Oakville, a house owned by his mother. That had been the arrangement from the beginning, presented as generosity. His mother, whom I will call my daughter's mother-in-law because that is what she was, had offered them the house at a reduced rent when they were first married and couldn't yet afford to buy. It seemed kind at the time. It seemed like family helping family. What it actually was, as I came to understand over the years, was a leash. The mother-in-law lived 20 minutes away in a much larger house in Burlington, and she had opinions about everything. How Joanna kept the kitchen, how she dressed the children, how she spent what little money she earned part-time at the dental office where she worked 4 days a week. When Lily was born, the mother-in-law began appearing at the house without calling ahead. When Joanna asked gently if she could please give a bit of notice, the woman went to her son and told him that Joanna was isolating him from his family. That was her word, isolating. And the trouble was that her son, my son-in-law, believed his mother in the way that certain people believe their earliest teachers. Not because the evidence was there, but because the belief was already built into the structure of who he was. Questioning his mother meant questioning the version of himself she had always reflected back to him, and that was something he simply could not do. Things got worse slowly, then all at once. The mother-in-law began spending more time at the Oatville house. She started offering to pick up the children from school, from daycare, and then began adjusting those arrangements without telling Joanna, changing pickup times, taking them for dinner without asking, dropping them home late on school nights. When Joanna objected, my son-in-law said she was being controlling. When Joanna asked him to speak to his mother, he said she was the one causing problems. I saw my daughter become a smaller version of herself during those years. She stopped calling as often. When she did call, she was careful, measured in a way she'd never been with me before. I knew what that meant. I'd seen it before in other women. She was managing information. She was trying to keep the peace by keeping me at arm's length, because she'd learned that anything she told me might somehow make its way back and become a problem. Then 8 weeks before she called me from that park bench, something happened. The mother-in-law came to my son-in-law with documents. I say documents because that's the word Joanna used, and she said it the way you say a word when you still can't fully absorb what it means in context. Documents, papers, printed pages that the mother-in-law had apparently gathered over several months, which she claimed showed that Joanna had been taking money from the household account, their shared account, and transferring it to a personal account without her husband's knowledge. The numbers on the papers looked real. The transactions looked real. The account numbers were partially visible, enough to seem credible, without being fully checkable at a glance. My son-in-law confronted Joanna that night. She denied it because she hadn't done it, because there was nothing to admit, but she was flustered and unprepared, and the more she protested, the worse it looked. By the end of the week, her husband had spoken to a lawyer. By the end of the following week, he had asked her to leave the house that was owned by his mother. She was given a week's notice. She was not given any help with moving costs. She had access to their shared account frozen pending the dispute, which meant she had her dental office paycheck, her portion of the Canada Child Benefit payments, and whatever she could put on a credit card that was in her name alone. She called me from the park because she didn't know where else to go. She hadn't wanted to worry me. She'd spent the first 3 days after being asked to leave staying with a friend from work. But the friend had a 1-bedroom apartment and 2 cats to which Marcus was allergic, and she couldn't ask her to keep hosting 4 people indefinitely. She had been sitting on that park bench for 45 minutes before she called me, trying to decide, she told me later, whether she was being dramatic. She was not being dramatic. I drove her and the children to my house. I made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, the good kind, from scratch, the kind I used to make when Joanna was little and sick and needed something warm. Marcus ate 2 sandwiches. Lily woke up from her nap and asked if we were at Grandma's house, and when Joanna said yes, she seemed entirely satisfied with the situation and asked for apple juice. After the children were in bed, Marcus in the spare room, Lily on a cot I'd set up beside him, both of them asleep within 20 minutes, the way exhausted children mercifully are. I sat down at the kitchen table with Joanna and a pot of tea, and I said, "Now tell me everything, and don't spare anything because you think I'll worry." She told me everything. When she finished, I sat for a moment. I wrapped both hands around my mug, and then I said, "The documents she showed your husband, do you have any idea where she got account information that looked like yours?" Joanna shook her head, but then she stopped. "She had access to the mail," she said slowly. "She used to collect it sometimes. When we were at work, she had a key." I nodded. "Those documents weren't proof of anything," I said. "They were a fabrication built around real-looking details. And if we look carefully, they will have errors, because she isn't a lawyer, and she isn't an accountant, and she put this together to frighten your husband, not to survive actual scrutiny. Joanna stared at me. How do you know that? I looked at my daughter across my kitchen table, this woman I had raised, who used to fall asleep in this very chair as a toddler, who had spent the last 2 years becoming smaller and quieter and more careful, and I said, because I've been in business for 40 years, my love, and I know what real financial documents look like. Here is something I have never made a point of announcing. I am not a retired schoolteacher. I am not a widow living on a pension. I'm a woman who spent 4 decades in commercial real estate, who started as an administrative assistant at a small property management firm in Hamilton in 1983, and who, through a combination of education I completed part-time while raising Joanna on my own, relentless attention to detail, and the particular advantage of being consistently underestimated by men who thought they were smarter than me, ended up owning a portion of that firm outright. We managed properties across the Greater Toronto area, office buildings, retail plazas, some residential. I had stepped back from day-to-day operations 2 years earlier, at 62, but I retained my ownership stake and I remained on the board. I knew tenants. I knew leases. I knew how money actually moved between accounts and what paper trails actually looked like. I also knew something that Joanna did not know, because I had never told her, partly out of a lifelong habit of privacy around money, and partly because I had never wanted her to feel the weight of it, which was that 6 years ago, when the mother-in-law had offered my daughter and her new husband that house in Oakville at a generous rent. I had quietly made some inquiries. The mother-in-law was a woman who presented as wealthy. She had a large house, a late-model car, the particular confidence of someone who has always had just enough resources to be above consequences. But her business affairs, which I had looked into through channels available to someone in my industry, were significantly less solid than she presented. She had 2 small rental properties she managed herself. She had debt she was servicing on the Burlington house. She had a line of credit that she used with a regularity that suggested she needed it. And one of those rental properties, a commercial unit in a plaza on Dundas Street West, was managed by our firm, had been for 11 years. The owner of the plaza was a client of ours, and the mother-in-law rented retail space from him for a small home decor business she operated. She was, in practical terms, a tenant of a property that my company managed. I had known this since shortly after Joanna's wedding. I had said nothing because it was not relevant, because it was not my business, because I hoped never to need to make it relevant. I had not renewed my hope in that direction for some time. 2 days after Joanna arrived at my house, I drove to our firm's offices in Mississauga. My name was still on the door, which I had always found quietly satisfying. I met with our legal counsel, a woman named Harriet who had worked with me for 16 years and who had the useful quality of being entirely unshockable, and I laid out what I needed. First, a detailed review of the documents Joanna's mother-in-law had presented to my son-in-law. Joanna had photographed them before she left the house, not knowing why exactly, just the instinct to have evidence. Those photographs were now on my phone, and I sent them to Harriet before I left the meeting. Second, a letter to the mother-in-law from our firm noting that her lease on the Dundas Street unit was coming up for review and that we would require a meeting to discuss renewal terms, which had changed due to updated market rates in the area. This was true. It had nothing to do with anything personal. It was routine, and it would bring her into a room. Third, I called my son-in-law. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I have no interest in making myself sound like something I am not. I did not call him to threaten him. I did not call him to berate him. I called him because he was the father of my grandchildren, and because, whatever his failures as a husband and as a person who should have protected his wife, I believed he was not fundamentally malicious. I believed he was a man who had been given a false version of the truth by someone he trusted more than he should have, and that if he were given the actual truth in a form he could not dismiss, he might do the right thing. I asked him to meet me for coffee. He sounded wary. He said he didn't think that was appropriate given the circumstances. I told him I wasn't calling to argue. I told him I had information I thought he should see before he made any permanent decisions. I told him I was his children's grandmother, and that I was asking him as one adult to another for an hour of his time. He came. We met at a Tim Hortons near his office in Mississauga, neutral ground, public, ordinary in the particular way that Canadian coffee shops are ordinary, with hockey highlights on the corner TV and someone's hockey bag by the door. I brought a folder. I set it on the table. "Before you look at this," I said, "I want to tell you something. I'm not here because I hate you. I'm not here because I think you're a bad person. I'm here because I think someone gave you information that wasn't true, and I think you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting what you do next if you act on it." He looked at the folder. He looked at me. "Open it," I said. Harriet's team had worked quickly. They had compared the documents the mother-in-law had produced with actual records from my daughter's bank, which Joanna had authorized me to access in writing that same morning. The account numbers on the mother-in-law's documents were close to Joanna's real account numbers, but not identical. The transaction dates, when cross-referenced with Joanna's actual statements, corresponded to no real transactions. The formatting of the documents used a template that Harriet recognized from a legal document service available online for $45 a month. They were fabricated, thoroughly, carefully, but not quite carefully enough. I watched my son-in-law read. I watched the color change in his face. I watched him go back to the beginning and read it again. "She made these up," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." He set the papers down. He put his hands flat on the table. He stared at the far wall for a long time, and I let him stare because there was nothing I could add to what he was looking at. "Why?" he said finally, and I wasn't sure if he was asking me or asking the air. "Because your wife was building a life with you that your mother felt was pulling you away from her," I said, "and because some people would rather burn everything down than feel like they're losing control of it." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "The house." "Your mother owns the house," I said. "You can make different arrangements, but yes, that's something you need to sort out." He nodded slowly. "There's something else you should know," I said. I told him about the commercial property, about our firm, about the lease review. I told him clearly and without emphasis, as information he was entitled to have, that I was not in a position to influence his mother's tenancy one way or another for personal reasons, that Harriet handled those matters on the merits, and that I would not involve myself. I said this so he would know I was telling him, not threatening him. There is a difference, and it matters, and I wanted him to understand it. He understood it. He called his mother that afternoon. I know this because Joanna called me that evening, sounding like herself for the first time in longer than I could properly remember. She didn't give me details of what happened between her husband and his mother. She said she didn't fully know, only that he had called her and that whatever he'd said had shaken the woman badly, and that he'd asked Joanna if they could speak, really speak. I told Joanna that was her decision, all of it. I told her I hadn't done any of this to save her marriage. I didn't know if her marriage could be saved, and I didn't know if she wanted it to be. I had done it so that she would not be driven out of her life by a lie, so that her children would not grow up on the wrong side of a false accusation, and so that the woman responsible would understand that actions have weight regardless of whether you expect to be held accountable for them. Joanna said, "How long have you known? About the property, about all of it?" "Since about a month after your wedding," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Because you were happy, I said. And it wasn't information you needed. I hoped you'd never need it. But you kept it. I keep things, I said. Old habit. She laughed a little, which was the first time I'd heard her laugh in weeks, and it hit me somewhere behind the sternum, the way your children's laughter always does, at any age, when you've been afraid you might not hear it for a while. The lease review for the Dundas Street property went ahead as scheduled. I was not in the meeting. Harriet handled it, as she always did, on the facts. The market rate for that retail space had indeed increased, as it had across the corridor, and the new terms reflected that. The mother-in-law chose not to renew. She closed the home decor business at the end of November. I don't know what happened in the weeks after that between my son-in-law and his mother. That's not my story to tell. What I know is that Joanna and the children moved back to the Oakville house with a new rental agreement that was in both their names, no longer the mother-in-law's, which required some careful restructuring that the property's owner was, once explained, willing to accommodate. I had nothing to do with that negotiation. I offered to, if needed. I was not needed. Lily's 4th birthday was at my house, the 2nd week of December. We had a chocolate cake and streamers, and Marcus wrapped his sister's present himself in approximately half a roll of tape. My son-in-law came. He sat across from me at the table, and we were polite to each other in the careful way of two people who have seen each other clearly and are choosing, for the sake of the people they both love, to start from there. Joanna caught me alone in the kitchen while Lily was opening presents. She said, "I don't know how to thank you." I handed her a piece of cake and said, "You don't. That's not how this works." "Mum." "You called me," I said. "That's all you need to do. You call me and I come." She leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment, the way she used to when she was small and the world had frightened her in some way that sleep would fix. She's 34 years old, and she still fits there exactly the same. I went back to the garden in the spring. The tomatoes came back better than the year before, the way things sometimes do when you cut them down to nothing and give them time. I keep thinking about the moment Joanna asked me why I never told her, about the property, about what I knew. The honest answer is that I didn't tell her because I hoped the day would never come when it mattered. I wanted her to have a marriage that didn't need me standing somewhere in the background with information in a folder. Nobody wants that for their child. You want them to build something solid enough that none of the old scaffolding is ever required again. But here's what I've come to understand after 64 years of watching people make decisions and live inside the consequences of them, the things we choose to do when no one is watching us, the small dishonesties, the quiet cruelties, the documents put together in the belief that no one will ever look closely enough. Those things don't disappear. They sit in the structure of a life the way rot sits in wood. You can paint over it. You can furnish the room beautifully. But the weight will find it eventually. What the mother-in-law did wasn't a spontaneous act of anger. It was planned. It was painch. That kind of calculated harm requires a person to silence something in themselves repeatedly, over months, and to keep choosing the wrong thing even when there were 100 moments to stop. That's not a lapse in judgment. That's a choice about who you're willing to be. And the world has a way of organizing itself over time around who you actually are rather than who you present yourself to be. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because I think it's true and because I think it's worth sitting with. What I'm prouder of, if I'm being honest about this, is Joanna. Not for calling me, though she should have called sooner, and I told her so. I'm proud of her for the 2 years before that call when she was trying to hold something together in the most difficult of circumstances, when she was being systematically told that her own perceptions were wrong, and when she kept, quietly, stubbornly, trusting herself anyway. She didn't collapse into bitterness. She didn't retaliate. She kept getting Marcus to school on time. and Lily to her swimming lessons on Wednesday mornings and doing her job at the dental office with enough competence that her boss noticed. That kind of steadiness in the middle of being undermined that takes something real, a spine made of something that doesn't bend easily. And the piece I want to say about my own part in this, without making it more than it was, I was ready because I had paid attention, not because I'm clever, though I've worked hard to be competent at the things I do. Ready because 40 years in business taught me that the most useful thing you can carry is accurate information kept quietly until it's needed. I didn't set out to have leverage. I set out to understand the situation my daughter was walking into. Those are different things, and the difference matters to me. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's that those three things, knowing right from wrong and holding to it even when it costs you, developing the actual skills and knowledge to act when action is required, and having the patience to endure difficulty without abandoning either of the first two, those aren't separate qualities, they work together. Joanna had all three of them, even when she couldn't see it herself. That's what got her through, not me. Me showing up with a folder was the last 10 minutes of a story she'd been living with integrity for 2 years before I arrived. I went back to the garden in spring. The tomatoes did better than the year before. That's usually how it goes when you've cleared out what wasn't working and given things room to grow properly.